Hello from the Channel studio in London and welcome to another edition of Foreign Dispatches, the program that takes you around the world in 25 minutes. I'm Teniola Oyetayo. On the program this week, humanitarian agencies rushed to respond to situation in Sudan amid huge funding gap in the Horn of Africa. Plus, UN chief says Afghanistan faces the largest humanitarian crisis in today's world while calling for more funding for the country. The fighting in the Sudanese capital, Khartoum, which erupted on April the 15th, has made hundreds of thousands of people flee their homes and triggered a humanitarian aid crisis. According to the United Nations, the number of people internally displaced within Sudan more than doubled in a week to 700,000. But experts warn the humanitarian emergency is spreading, creating a dangerous situation in the Horn of Africa. Halim Yaqub fled Sudan's violence with her 5 children. 4 days after arriving in neighboring Chad, she says they're yet to receive any assistance.
We were forced to flee without taking anything with us, and now we are starving. We have been here for 4 days, and we are totally dependent on the food given to us by the Chadian families in the next village. We have small children. We can't go to work and leave them alone to starve. We have no choice but to stay with them here, and we hope that in a few days the security situation in Sudan will be stabilized and we can return home.
While aid agencies are rushing to distribute food and register new arrivals, resources are tight.
We are loading our trucks now for the 10,000, 20,000 as per UNHCR and the government's figures that may have crossed already the border from Sudan to Chad. It's extremely important. We have already, prior to that crisis, 400,000 Sudanese refugees on that border that we were supporting. It's extremely urgent because in 6 to 8 weeks, we will never be able to reach those places because of the rains. So it's urgent. Also now for the host population, we should expect maybe more. We really need to preposition, and for that we need funding, we need resources to help the government in hosting and now hosting more refugees that are coming. We really need help.
The demand for life-saving humanitarian assistance in the region has been growing. Now, after conflict erupted between Sudan's army and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, an additional 5 million people in Sudan will need emergency assistance, half of them children, according to the United Nations. By October, some 860,000 people are expected to have fled to neighboring countries, including South Sudan, which has its own dire humanitarian crisis.
This crisis couldn't come at a worse time. You know, in South Sudan, we're entering the annual lean season and the rainy season when, access is difficult. We already have 7.4 million people in need of food assistance in South Sudan. We're unable to reach them all because of the resourcing challenges. We've had to cut our programs because of severe funding constraints. And now again, we're having to reprioritize between hungry people, these new arrivals who are extremely vulnerable.
More than 2 million people are said to be displaced in South Sudan, and 3/4 of the 11 million strong population need aid.
Since the conflict broke out, we have registered over 25,000 people who have crossed, but the numbers are likely much higher because we cannot register everyone, and many people are also crossing via informal border points. South Sudan is one of UNHCR's most underfunded crises already, and we are now mobilizing to support this new influx of individuals. We're of course very concerned about that. This humanitarian situation, as I said, is severely underfunded already. And we urge the international community to not forget about South Sudan.
The World Food Programme fears the conflict and influx will worsen an already critical humanitarian crisis in the region and risk morphing into a broader disaster.
WFP, our biggest concern right now is actually that if the conflict in Sudan doesn't stop soon, the ripple effect across the region is significant. We are already seeing at least 20,000 refugees that have crossed into Chad. Our colleagues in South Sudan are saying a similar number, if not more, is crossing into South Sudan. You're thinking about refugees who are in Sudan going back to their home countries that are not as stable as they should be when they are going back. So the ripple effect for the region is significant. It's a real concern, and we just need to find peace. We need the two parties to the conflict to come together and find a way to resolve the conflict, because this has the possibility of destabilizing the whole region.
Just as demand is escalating, resources are being diminished. Analysis of UN funding data for Africa shows financial support from key donor governments is dropping off.
There is going to be less funding this year. I pray there won't be, but the reality of it is that there is going to be less. And so we're going to have to work on doing more with less, and also making sure that we don't have to make serious choices in all of this. I don't want to have to do that. I want to make sure that everyone gets the services, the food, and the assistance that they need here.
Aid workers, diplomats, and donor government officials say funding gaps are likely to grow. That's as Europe focuses on the war in Ukraine, and some lawmakers in the United States target budget cuts.
I'm really worried for 2023, honestly, because already in 2022, the gap between assessed needs and available funding grew. It grew in Sudan and virtually all other countries except Ukraine, where we have operations. The only fully funded operation in the world now is in Ukraine. All other operations are catastrophically underfunded.
Meanwhile, according to the International Organization for Migration, more than 700,000 people are now displaced within Sudan since fighting began.
The number of people internally displaced in Sudan has more than doubled in the last week, according to data that's been collected by the International Organization for Migration's Displacement Tracking Matrix. Now, more than 700,000 people are now internally displaced by the fighting, which began on the 15th of April, according to this latest data. Last Tuesday, the figure stood at 340,000. And of course, prior to the fighting, an estimated 3.7 million people were internally displaced in Sudan. Latest report identifies increases in IDPs in multiple areas, in the White Nile, River Nile, Northern State, and Al Jazeera State, as well as parts of Khartoum State and the capital, where clashes are continuing. Many IDPs are sheltering with relatives, while others are gathering in schools, mosques, and public buildings, scenes that we see repeatedly over and over again around the world.
For nearly a month, millions of residents have cowered in their homes from airstrikes and artillery battles, many cut off from power and water and struggling to restock on food. Over 600 people have also been killed and more than 5,000 injured since the violence erupted on April the 15th between the rival factions. Also dealing with a huge humanitarian situation is Afghanistan, where years of armed conflict and chronic poverty has left 28.3 million people in need of assistance in 2023. With a humanitarian appeal of $4.6 billion, Afghanistan is the world's largest aid operation, but it's also the least funded. Every morning, the teachers of Billy High School in Afghanistan make their way to the river carrying inner tubes. They use them to commute to the school they teach in the country's eastern Nangarhar province, paddling their raft across fast-moving water to get to the other side of the 46-meter-wide river. There are no bridges or boats to make the journey easier, and for years, staff have used this means of transport. The school they teach at currently has 1,040 students, including girls attending primary classes. It was opened in 2004, but the Education Ministry told them just 3 years later that the school complex was too dilapidated for use. There are only 3 classrooms left now, and most of the classes are held outdoors.
We don't have enough books. It has been a while since books were last distributed to our province. No attention has been paid to this school. As you can see, our students are studying under the sky.
Sometimes it rains, and students are gathered into 2 or 3 classrooms. Teachers sit outside after classes since they have no proper office. Teachers like Rahman have no other way to make a living. He says his salary of between about $69 to $92 per month is hardly enough to support his family. After decades of war, Afghanistan remains one of the poorest and least developed countries in the world. Its financial crisis has only worsened since the return of the Taliban to power in mid-August 2021. There are fears that the Afghan people are in for a very difficult year as donors grapple with challenging a Taliban administration crackdown on women and girls, more crises around the world, and overall less funding. Since toppling the Western-backed government in 2021, the group has tightened controls on women's access to public life, including barring women from university and closing girls' secondary schools.
In the 18 months since the Taliban took Kabul, we have seen a sustained campaign to take women out of life in Afghanistan. You've mentioned the primary schools, universities, being able to walk in the parks, participating in NGO delivery, and these rather egregious examples of humanitarian aid, healthcare, for example, being delivered to men that to pass on to women. We have already cut our funding to Afghanistan, but we are very caught because, as I said, 2 out of 3 people in Afghanistan are desperately dependent on humanitarian aid. So we are trying to fulfill that need, working with partners, at the same time as making sure that we do not give anything that would give the Taliban reason to think that they can carry on in this medieval way.
In April, the Taliban began enforcing the ban on Afghan women working for the United Nations, after stopping most women working for aid groups in December 2022. The United Nations has some 3,300 Afghan staff, of which about 400 are women.
The United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan reiterates its commitment to stay and deliver on behalf of the men, women, and children of Afghanistan, and appeals to our donors to keep funding the assistance people need. To achieve this efficiently and effectively, the UN needs all its personnel, women and men, to work in communities and UN offices unimpeded. We're working to come to decisions on appropriate working modalities. Obviously, we have a challenge because the needs of the Afghan people are immense, and we intend to fulfill those needs. But at the same time, our operations are clearly impeded for the reasons we have described. And until the de facto authorities change their policies, our position on the need to allow all staff, men and women, to work in communities in Afghanistan remains unchanged.
According to the UN chief, the situation in Afghanistan is the largest humanitarian crisis in the world today. The United Nations has said it will stay in Afghanistan to try to help millions of people in need, but funding is drying up.
It is difficult to overestimate the gravity of the situation in Afghanistan. It is the largest humanitarian crisis in the world today. The current ban on Afghan women working for the United Nations and national and international NGOs is unacceptable and puts lives in jeopardy.
Last year, the United Nations launched a $4.6 billion appeal to assist more than 23 million of the most vulnerable Afghans this year. Although Afghanistan is the world's largest aid operation, it's also the UN's lowest funded operation globally, at less than 7%. Thanks for staying with us on the program. The Democratic Republic of Congo has observed a day of national mourning in memory of the dead and missing in South Kivu province following deadly floods and landslides there. It's one of the deadliest natural disasters in the country's recent history. Experts say extreme weather events are happening with increased frequency and intensity due to climate change.
Survivors were still searching for the bodies of their loved ones on Tuesday, 5 days after the floods and landslides hit South Kivu province. It's one of the worst natural disasters to hit the Democratic Republic of Congo in recent history.
We lost 6 people in our family. In our house, 5 children are dead, and a mother as well. We have nothing. I'm asking myself how we are going to live. At this moment, we have nothing. My mind is not at ease. I'm afraid of becoming insane.
That's where I used to live. My husband was killed. He was on guard duty. He was a policeman, and he was washed away while he was working. His mother and younger brother died as well. I have 5 children left. I don't know what I'm going to do. We have nowhere to live.
Rains wiped out entire villages, along with fields of crops and livestock, leaving communities reeling. Over 400 people have been killed and about 3,000 people have lost their homes. With thousands of people still missing, the death toll is expected to rise. Aid efforts have been affected by a lack of access and resources. Residents of Bushushu and Niamukubi villages, hardest hit by the disaster, have had to travel long distances on foot to evacuate to neighbouring villages, some as far as a 3-hour walk away. On Monday, a national day of mourning was held for the victims. Floods and landslides are not uncommon in South Kivu. The last incident of a similar scale in the DRC occurred in October 2014, when heavy rainfall destroyed over 700 homes. More than 130 people were reported missing at the time. The UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, called the DRC flooding yet another illustration of the climate crisis's disastrous impact on countries that have done nothing to contribute to global warming.
Africa needs climate action. The brutal injustice of climate change is on full display with every flood, drought, famine, and heat wave endured on this continent. The countries least responsible for this crisis are feeling its most devastating impacts.
South Kivu shares a border with Rwanda and was also hit by heavy rains which triggered flooding and landslides last week, killing over 100 people and destroying more than 5,000 homes. Uganda also experienced flooding, which caused 18 deaths and left thousands displaced. Predictions by the World Bank suggest about 86 million Africans will migrate within their own countries by 2050 as a result of the climate crisis.
The impact of climate change is amplifying vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities, in many cases, are leading to conflict, competition over resources, forcing people to move, and unfortunately in some situations that's erupting into violence. Whether it be in the Sahel, East Africa, Southern Asia, the Americas, no one is immune to the impact of climate change. But the difference is that there are some populations who are more at risk than others.
Extreme weather events are occurring with increased frequency in the region, from a severe drought in the eastern Horn of Africa to excessive rainfall in other parts of East and Central Africa.
And finally on the program, we head over to South Africa, where farmers are currently struggling to grow crops and vegetables owing to the recent weather patterns. They are blaming climate change for these smaller yields, and animal farmers are complaining too. According to the United Nations, climate change is affecting every continent and ocean on the planet, and the situation is likely to get worse in the coming years. Our South African correspondent, Innocent Mosa, visited some farms near Pretoria and now reports.
In South Africa, tomato is king. Tomatoes are used in stews to complement a dish. They are also popular in the world. Every year, South Africa exports around 231 million kilograms of tomatoes. Due to the effects of climate change, local farmers are worried.
Rains start late.
Mama Bolo has been farming in this area for the past 5 years and has first-hand experience with the impact of climate change on his farm.
Our winters are no longer as long as they used to be. We used to know that May, June, July is our winter. But now our May is very warm. You actually don't experience the winter. You actually have winter for 2 months, which is June and July. So that is basically saying the way you do your crop planning has to change and respond to these shifts.
South Africa is considered one of the top 10 countries vulnerable to climate change. The country is popularly vulnerable to a range of climate-related risks, including droughts, floods, and sea level rise. This can compromise animal health.
For the lack of having enough maize, it means that we are going to have a problem of poverty and problem again with the production of animal feed. And if we don't have enough animal feed, it means that a farmer who had perhaps, I can give an example, with 20 cows or 20 cattle, now has to reduce the number in terms of can be 10 or 5 because of less amount of feed being available.
Well, in a quest to address climate change, South Africa has set a target to reduce emissions by 42% by 2025, but it would seem like implementation has been hampered by slow political will and, of course, inadequate policy implementation from government.
We also agree with the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, that we can no longer afford any further delays in mitigating the effect of climate change. African countries are losing between 3 to 5% of their GDP.
One type of thing that can help.
Experts say modern farming can help fight the effects of climate change.
So being up to date with what is expected to happen during the next week, during the next month, or during the growing season, or the summer or winter that's coming. So being able to know from this available sources what is going to happen. And then obviously it's very important that those sources provide useful information. So useful information that the farmer will be able to use.
However, some of these techniques can be costly, especially for small-scale farmers. Meanwhile, for farmers like Mama Bolo, the journey continues.
And that's the program today, but remember, our top stories are never far away. You can catch them on channelcv.com. Thank you for watching. I'm Tenyola Oyetayo. Bye for now.